In the decaying grandeur of the long-shuttered Blackwood Asylum, a historian unearths the 1921 intake records of twin sisters who were erased from existence. A single, handmade doll, hidden for a century, becomes the only voice for the dead, its silence screaming a truth more horrific than any ghost story. She soon discovers the asylum's celebrated physician was not a healer but a predator, and the twins' disappearance was not a tragedy but the beginning of a monstrous experiment. The air in the Blackwood Asylum archives was a physical presence, thick with the dust of forgotten lives and the faint, cloying scent of decaying paper. Eleanor Vance felt its weight settle upon her as she navigated the narrow aisles, her footsteps muted by the sheer volume of history pressing in from every side. Towering metal shelves, sagging under the burden of countless manila folders and leather-bound ledgers, rose into the gloom like the ribs of some great skeletal beast. It was here, in the institution's silent, catalogued heart, that the dead were meant to rest, their stories neatly filed and closed. But Eleanor was not looking for stories that were finished. She was hunting for the ones that had been deliberately left untold. Her research, funded by a modest grant from the Ohio Historical Society, was meant to be a simple demographic study of patient intake during the early 20th century. It was an academic exercise in statistics and social trends, a work of dry data that was never intended to bleed. Her fingers, smudged with the gray grime of the past, danced across the brittle edges of countless records. Each file represented a life funneled into the asylum's gaping maw. Farmers broken by hardship, soldiers shattered by the Great War, women cast away for soyo hysteria. For weeks, Eleanor had meticulously compiled her data, her focus squarely on the numbers, the diagnoses, the typical patient trajectories. She had grown accustomed to the rhythms of institutional life, as documented on paper, intake, treatment, and eventual release, or, as was often the case, a final entry noting a peaceful passing and a plot number in the asylum's cemetery. The paperwork, for all its clinical coldness, followed a predictable bureaucratic logic. It was a system designed to account for every soul that passed through Blackwood's iron gates, ensuring no one could simply be lost. It was on a Tuesday, late in the afternoon, as golden light slanted through the grimy arched windows, that the system failed. She was working through the records for 1921, a year of particular interest due to a statewide push for mental hygiene reform. She pulled the file for Harper, Iris, the name written in a crisp, elegant cursive. The intake photograph showed a young girl of perhaps 9 or 10, with a cascade of fiery red hair and a smile that seemed impossibly bright for a child on the threshold of such a grim place. The listed reason for admission was vague, citing melancholia and unnatural sibling attachment. Eleanor felt a familiar pang of sympathy, a quiet sorrow for the girl whose light was about to be extinguished by the asylum's shadow. She set the file aside and reached for the next one in the sequence, expecting a different name, a different face. Instead, she found herself staring at the same face. The file read Harper, Rose, and the photograph showed a girl identical to the first in every detail, from the scattering of freckles across her nose to the hopeful, trusting light in her eyes. They were twins, a fact confirmed by the shared date of birth and address. Eleanor's historical curiosity sharpened into a more focused interest. The treatment of twins in early psychiatric institutions was a niche but fascinating area of study. She placed the two intake forms side by side, a matched set, two sisters who had walked through the asylum's doors together on a spring morning in 1921. A complete record, she thought, would be a valuable find. It was with this academic thrill that she began the search for the corresponding documents that would tell her what happened next. She started with the discharge ledgers. She cross-referenced the admissions date, searching for any entry for Iris or Rose Harper in the months and years that followed. There was nothing. The asylum was meticulous in its record-keeping, a fact that both impressed and disturbed her. Every patient released, whether cured, transferred, or simply sent home to die, was signed out with the same dispassionate precision with which they were signed in. Yet the Harper twins, admitted on May 3, 1921, were absent from every discharge list for the 1920s. Perhaps they had been transferred to another facility, a common practice for specialized cases. Eleanor spent the next several hours poring over the transfer orders, her optimism slowly beginning to fray. She found records for patients sent to state hospitals in Cleveland and Columbus, but the names Iris and Rose Harper were nowhere among them. A cold knot began to tighten in her stomach. The logical, orderly world of the archive was beginning to feel unstable, its foundational rules bending around this one specific silent absence that left only one final grim possibility. With a sense of growing dread, she pulled the heavy, cloth-bound death registries from their shelf. She ran her finger down the alphabetized lists of the dead, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She checked 1921, then 1922, and then, with a mounting sense of disbelief, she searched every single year up to the asylum's closure in the 1970s. The registry was filled with the names of those who had succumbed to disease, old age, or the quiet despair of institutional life, but the names of Iris and Rose Harper were not there. They had been admitted, two vibrant, smiling girls captured in a black and white photograph. They had been assigned patient numbers, given beds in a ward, and become part of the asylum's official population, and then they had vanished. There were no discharge papers to mark their departure from Blackwood. There were no transfer orders to indicate they had been sent elsewhere. There were no death certificates to certify their passing. It was as if, after signing their names into the asylum's great book, the two little girls had simply ceased to exist, their entire paper trail swallowed whole by the institution itself. The neatly filed stories had been a lie, a carefully constructed illusion of order. Eleanor Vance now knew that the archives did not just hold the stories of the dead, they held their secrets too. The academic exercise was over. An investigation had just begun. Eleanor approached the archivist's desk, the two intake forms for the Harper twins held carefully in her hand. Mr. Alistair Finch did not look up immediately, his attention fixed on a delicate task of repairing the spine of a decaying book with archival glue. He was a man who seemed to have absorbed the characteristics of his domain, old, meticulously preserved and shrouded in a thin layer of dust and silence. His movements were slow and deliberate, the careful motions of someone who believed that the past was a fragile thing, to be handled with the utmost reverence and control. Eleanor had always found him courteous but distant, a gatekeeper who permitted access to his kingdom but never truly welcomed visitors into its deeper chambers. His job, as he had once explained to her, was not just to preserve the records, but to protect the legacy of Blackwood Asylum. "Mr. Finch," she began, her voice a respectful intrusion into the quiet sanctity of his work, "I seem to have found an anomaly." She laid the two files on his desk, the smiling faces of Iris and Rose looking up from the faded photographs. "I have their intake forms from 1921, but I can find no other records for them. No discharge, no transfer, no death certificate." Alistair glanced at the papers, his expression unreadable, a placid mask of professional detachment. He picked up one of the forms, his eyes lingering for a moment on the photograph before he set it down. "Ah, yes, a clerical error, most likely," he said, his voice as dry and brittle as the pages he mended. It was not uncommon in those days for paperwork to be misplaced, especially during periods of administrative turnover. He offered the explanation with a calm, almost rehearsed finality, a simple, logical answer designed to smooth over the inconsistency and restore order. Eleanor, however, was not so easily dissuaded. "A misplaced file is one thing, Mr. Finch," she countered, her tone polite but firm. "But this is their entire history. It's as if they walked in and never walked out." Alistair offered a thin, dismissive smile. "My dear Miss Vance, you must understand the sheer volume of paperwork this institution produced. To expect a perfect, unbroken chain of documentation for every single patient across 6 decades is, if you'll forgive me, a bit naive." He turned his attention back to his book, a clear signal that for him the conversation was over. The anomaly had been identified, explained, and filed away under the convenient heading of bureaucratic incompetence. But Eleanor felt a prickle of unease, a sense that his explanation was too neat, too practiced. It wasn't an answer, it was a wall. Frustrated and unconvinced, Eleanor returned to the archives, the archivist's easy dismissal echoing in her mind. She refused to believe that two little girls could simply be erased by a filing error. The silence in their records felt less like an accident and more like a deliberate act of removal. Her gaze drifted to a section of the archive she had previously ignored, a cordoned-off corner filled with wooden crates and stacked boxes, all marked with a stark red stencil, Patient Effects, UNCL aimed, pending disposal. It was a sad, forgotten collection of the lives left behind, the small personal trinkets of people who had died or departed without family to collect their meager belongings. Driven by a sudden, inexplicable impulse, she decided to look. The asylum was scheduled to transfer these items to a county warehouse for permanent, anonymous storage at the end of the month. This was her last chance to see what remnants of the lost souls still remained. She pried open the lid of the first crate, releasing a musty wave of mothballs in time. Inside lay a pathetic collection of personal artifacts, a tarnished silver locket, a pair of worn wire-rimmed spectacles, a book of pressed flowers, its pages crumbling to the touch. Each object was a ghost, a tangible piece of a life interrupted. She moved from crate to crate, her search growing more desperate, more focused. She wasn't just looking for objects anymore, she was looking for a sign, a single piece of evidence that would prove the Harper twins had been more than just a name on a page. She sorted through crates corresponding to the 1920s, her hands growing numb from the cold and the grim task. Most of the items were generic, anonymous. Nothing connected to two little girls with red hair. Just as she was about to give up, her hand brushed against something soft at the bottom of a large wooden chest. She pulled it out. It was a handmade doll, stitched from what looked like a scrap of an old burlap sack, with button eyes and a crudely embroidered smile. Its most striking feature, however, was its hair. It was made not from yarn, but from a thick, vibrant lock of actual human hair, a deep and unmistakable shade of fiery red. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She fumbled for the intake form she still carried, her hands trembling as she held the doll next to the photograph of Iris and Rose. The color was a perfect match. This had to belong to one of them. It was a relic, a small piece of their forgotten life that had somehow survived the century of silence. As she examined the doll, turning it over in her hands, she felt a surge of validation, a grim triumph. This was proof. This was the connection she had been searching for. Then she noticed something else, a detail that seemed insignificant at first. On the doll's simple cloth torso, near its side was a small, carefully stitched tear in the seam. It was not a rip from age or rough play. The stitches were tight and deliberate, the work of a careful hand trying to mend a tiny, precise opening. It looked as if something had been pushed inside, and the fabric had been meticulously sewn shut afterward. The first major twist was delivered not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, dawning horror. The doll was not just a toy. It was a vessel. It was hiding a secret. Eleanor carried the doll back to the archivist's desk as if it were a holy relic, its presence a silent accusation. She placed it on the polished wood between them, directly in Alistair Finch's line of sight. The button eyes stared up at the vaulted ceiling, the lock of real red hair, a vibrant splash of life against the archive's muted tones. "I found this in a crate of unclaimed patient effects destined for disposal," she stated, her voice steady and clear. "The hair matches the girls in the intake photographs. This belonged to one of the Harper twins." She watched him for any flicker of recognition, any crack in his carefully composed facade. She needed to see that this physical proof, this tangible link to the lost children, could move him in a way the paper records could not. Alistair looked at the doll, his expression unchanging. He did not touch it. He simply observed it with the same detached curiosity he might afford any other artifact. "A charming little thing," he murmured, his voice infuriatingly calm. "It is a sad reality that many patients left behind such personal items." He folded his hands on his desk, creating a barrier between himself and the object. "As for your missing files, Miss Vance, I have been thinking about your query. I believe I have a more definitive answer for you now." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air, a master of controlling the narrative. He was not reacting to her discovery. He was absorbing it into his own pre-prepared story, neutralizing its power before it could take root. "There was a fire," Alistair began, his tone shifting to one of solemn historical recitation. "It occurred in the winter of 1933. It started in the West Wing Infirmary, and while it was contained before it could destroy the entire building, the records office for that section was completely lost. All transfer orders and discharge papers from that period were incinerated. He delivered the information with the practiced ease of someone who had told this story many times before. The Harper girls were almost certainly transferred to another facility long before the fire. Their paperwork was simply destroyed in the blaze. It is a tragic loss of historical data, but it is, regrettably, the most logical explanation for your missing paper trail. The story was plausible, complete, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was a firewall designed to extinguish any further inquiry. Eleanor stared at him, a cold fury rising within her. The explanation was too perfect. It accounted for everything while revealing nothing. It was a historical dead end, a neat and tidy conclusion to a messy and disturbing puzzle. And the doll? She pressed, refusing to let him dismiss it. What about this? Alistair finally allowed his gaze to drift back to the small burlap figure. A sad coincidence, he said, with a slight shrug. The asylum housed hundreds of children over the years. Red hair is not so terribly uncommon. The lie was so blatant, so dismissive, that it took Eleanor's breath away. He was actively working to bury the twins for a second time, erasing their memory with bureaucratic platitudes and feigned sympathy. The the detail that convinced Eleanor he was lying, was not in what he said, but in what he refused to do. She pushed the original intake photograph of the smiling twins across the desk, placing it directly beside the doll. "Look at them, Mr. Finch," she urged, her voice low and intense. "Look at their faces." It was a direct challenge, a plea for some shared humanity, some acknowledgement of the lives at the center of this mystery. Alistair Finch's eyes flickered toward the photograph, but he did not truly look at it. His gaze slid away, refusing to meet the hopeful, trusting eyes of the two little girls who had vanished under his institution's care. In that moment of deliberate evasion, Eleanor understood. He wasn't protecting a noble legacy from a simple clerical error. He was the final gatekeeper of a monstrous secret, and his official story was nothing more than the first layer of a carefully constructed tomb. The fire was his alibi. The truth was something much, much colder. She knew then that her investigation could not continue within these walls. Under his watchful, obstructive gaze, he would misdirect and mislead her at every turn, using the archive's own rules and supposed deficiencies as a shield. He had given her an official story, a convenient fiction to close the case, but in his refusal to look at the photograph of two smiling children, he had revealed everything. He was not just an archivist, he was a guardian of the asylum's darkness, and he was terrified of the light she was trying to bring. Eleanor picked up the doll, its hidden seam a silent promise of another truth. The official story was a lie. Her work was just beginning. Leaving the oppressive silence of the Blackwood archives behind, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. Alistair Finch's carefully constructed narrative of fire and filing errors had not deterred her, it had sharpened her resolve. If the truth was not within Blackwood's walls, it was because someone had taken great pains to remove it. She turned her attention to the vast, sprawling network of off-site archives, the scattered repositories where the overflow of a century's bureaucracy had been sent to be forgotten. For 2 weeks, she navigated the labyrinthine catalogs of the County Records Annex, a dreary, climate-controlled warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was a purgatory for paperwork, a place where history went to die a slow, anonymous death. She searched for anything connected to Blackwood Asylum that might have escaped Alistair's meticulous control. Her request was broad: any and all personnel files, private correspondence, or medical records transferred from the asylum between 1920 and 1940. The clerk, a young man more interested in his phone than the past, wheeled out a cart laden with dusty, unlabeled boxes. It was a needle in a haystack search, a descent into the mundane minutiae of institutional life. She sifted through requisitions for medical supplies, payroll disputes, and painfully dull administrative memos. The air grew thick with the dust of irrelevance, and her initial optimism began to wane, replaced by the weary ache of a fruitless search. The asylum, it seemed, had been just as thorough in its external housekeeping as its internal curation. Just as she was about to concede defeat for the day, her eyes caught on a small, unassuming cardboard box tucked away on the bottom shelf of the cart. Unlike the others, which were marked with official institutional stencils. This one bore a simple, handwritten label, Croft Botanical Illustrations and Notes. It was so out of place, so mundane, that it had likely been overlooked for decades. Her curiosity piqued by the anomaly, Eleanor lifted the lid. The box did not contain drawings of flowers. Instead, it was filled with a collection of leather-bound journals, their pages covered in a dense, spidery script. A small embossed nameplate on the inside cover of the first volume confirmed the owner's identity, Dr. Silas Croft. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the asylum's celebrated head physician from that era, the man who had personally signed the Harper twins' intake forms. She sat down at a dusty table, the silence of the annex pressing in on her as she opened the first journal. It was not an official record book. It was a private ledger, a secret chronicle of his work kept far from the prying eyes of hospital administrators and medical boards. The first several entries detailed his theories on heredity and mental illness, his language precise, arrogant, and chillingly detached. He wrote of his patients not as people but as specimens, raw material for his ambitious research. He saw Blackwood Asylum not as a place of healing but as a perfect self-contained laboratory, a place where the inconvenient variables of family and society could be eliminated, allowing for the pure, unadulterated study of the human mind in captivity. The pages radiated a cold, intellectual zeal that made Eleanor's skin crawl. She flipped through the ledger, her eyes scanning for the year 1921. And then she found it. The second major twist was not a single sentence, but a series of entries that unfolded over several pages, a calm, methodical account of a monstrous intention. Dr. Silas Croft had been fascinated by the phenomenon of identical twins. He saw them as a perfect, natural experiment, a chance to explore the very nature of identity, consciousness, and the soul. In an entry dated May 3, 1921, he wrote, "A pristine set has arrived today. Two physically and by all initial accounts psychically identical girls, Iris and Rose H. They exhibit a remarkable degree of shared identity, a codependency that I believe stifles the development of the individual self. They are not two people, but one soul inhabiting two bodies." The subsequent entries laid out his horrific hypothesis in painstaking detail. He believed that the bond between the twins was a psychological malady, a shared psychosis that could be surgically severed. The ledger detailed his plan for a new radical form of experimental therapy. He would isolate the sisters completely, subject them to psychological and emotional pressures, and meticulously document every stage of their divergence. He wrote of it as a noble, scientific pursuit. The Harper twins were not patients to be cured. They were listed in the ledger as the very first subjects in a new groundbreaking study, his magnum opus, a protocol for the forcible severance of a shared identity. The clinical, dispassionate language of the ledger was more terrifying than any scream. Eleanor was no longer just investigating a disappearance. She was uncovering a premeditated, scientifically justified atrocity, chronicled in the hand of the man the world remembered as a pioneer of medicine. The asylum wasn't a place of healing, it was a laboratory, and the Harper twins had just been delivered to the scientist's door. The cold, methodical evil documented in Dr. Croft's private ledger gave Eleanor a new, terrifying direction for her investigation. She now knew that the twins' disappearance was not an accident or a murder in the conventional sense. It was the outcome of a deliberate clinical experiment. To understand what happened inside that laboratory, she needed a witness, someone who had seen the doctor's theories put into practice. The official records were a dead end, and Alistair Finch was a wall of deception. She had to find a voice from the past that had not been silenced, a perspective from outside the high walls of Dr. Croft's authority. Her research led her to the small, sleepy town of Millfield, a place where many of Blackwood's former staff had retired. She was searching for ghosts, for the descendants of those who had walked the asylum's halls. After weeks of dead-end phone calls and polite but firm rejections from families who wanted to leave the past buried, she found a glimmer of hope. She located the granddaughter of a woman named Clara Bennett, a former nurse who had worked in the asylum's children's wing during the 1920s. The woman, now in her late 70s herself, was hesitant at first, wary of dredging up painful memories associated with the asylum. But when Eleanor mentioned her research into Dr. Silas Croft and the disappearance of two young twin girls, the woman's hesitation turned to a somber recognition. She invited Eleanor to her home, a small, immaculately kept house filled with the scent of lavender and old photographs. She explained that her grandmother had rarely spoken of her time at Blackwood, but that she had kept a detailed private journal, a place to confess the things she could not say aloud. The granddaughter retrieved a small, cloth-bound diary from a cedar chest, its pages yellowed and fragile with age. She handed it to Eleanor with a trembling hand. "My grandmother was a good woman," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But she saw things in that place, things that haunted her until the day she died." Eleanor opened the journal, the ink faded but the handwriting clear and steady. She quickly found the entries from 1921. Nurse Bennett's journal was the human counterpoint to Dr. Croft's cold, scientific ledger. It was filled with fear, pity, and a growing sense of dread. She described the arrival of the Harper twins, calling them two bright pennies in a jar of rust, her heart breaking for their confinement. The journal provided a horrifying, ground-level view of Croft's experiment. The nurse wrote of the doctor's strange and unsettling obsession with breaking the twins' profound bond. She documented his orders. The girls were to be kept in separate rooms, never allowed to see or speak to one another. Their names were even taken from them. They were referred to only as Subject A and Subject B in all official charts, an attempt to strip them of their shared identity. Nurse Bennett described how the twins, vibrant and cheerful upon arrival, began to wither in isolation. They refused to eat. They cried constantly, their shared melancholia deepening into a profound and terrifying despair. The nurse's entries became increasingly frantic, filled with a sense of helpless horror. She saw the cruelty of the doctor's methods, but she was a lowly nurse, powerless to question the absolute authority of the celebrated physician. The most chilling entry was dated nearly 6 months after the twins' arrival. Nurse Bennett described being on the night shift, the children's wing unnaturally silent. In the middle of the night, she was startled by a sound that she would never forget. It was not the sound of two children crying. It was a single, terrible scream that echoed through the long, dark corridor, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that was abruptly cut short. She rushed from her station toward the twins' isolation wing, her heart pounding with fear. But before she could reach their rooms, she was intercepted by Dr. Croft himself. He was calm, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He told her there had been a small night terror and that she was to return to her desk immediately. His voice was soft, but his command was absolute. The final devastating entry on the matter was written 1 week later. The nurse described her confusion and fear. In the days following the scream, she only ever saw one of the twins again. A single girl, hollow-eyed and silent, was occasionally seen being led from her room by the doctor, her spirit seemingly extinguished. She looked like Rose, but the nurse couldn't be sure. The light had gone out of her eyes. Then, one day, she too was gone. The rooms were empty. The official story passed down to the staff was that the girls had been successfully transferred to a long-term care facility better equipped to handle their unique condition. But Nurse Clara Bennett knew better. She had seen the doctor's obsession, she had felt the chill of his clinical cruelty, and she had heard that single, terrible scream in the night. The experiment had reached its conclusion. One sister had vanished, and the other had followed shortly after. The journal did not contain the whole truth, but it provided a vital, terrifying piece of it, the moment when two voices became one and then fell silent forever. Armed with a horrifying eyewitness account from Nurse Bennett's journal, Eleanor knew she had broken through Alistair Finch's wall of deception. She had the doctor's private intentions and a nurse's terrified observations. The archivist could no longer hide behind his flimsy story of a fire and clerical errors. She arranged another meeting, her demeanor no longer that of a curious academic, but of a determined investigator on the verge of exposing a century-old crime. She laid out her findings on his desk, a copy of Dr. Croft's ledger entry detailing his experimental protocol and a transcript of the nurse's journal, culminating in the account of the single, terrible scream. She watched him as he read, his placid composure finally showing the first signs of cracking. A faint sheen of sweat appeared on his brow. Alistair looked up from the papers, his eyes dark with a new defensive energy. He seemed to understand that his previous strategy of obstruction and dismissal would no longer suffice. "These are disturbing allegations, Miss Vance," he conceded, his voice strained. "But they are based on a secret, likely embellished, diary and a physician's private theoretical notes. They do not constitute proof of any wrongdoing." He was cornered, but he was not yet defeated. He retreated to a new line of defense, not of ignorance, but of official documentation. "You have been searching for an official account of what happened to the Harper twins," he said, rising from his chair. "Perhaps it is time I showed it to you." He walked to a locked filing cabinet in the corner of his office, a vault she had never seen him open before, and retrieved a single, slender file. He placed the file on the desk in front of her. The cover read, "Incident Report, Harper, I&R closed by order of Dr. Sepp." This was it. The official story that had been buried even deeper than the standard records. This was the truth that Alistair Finch had been truly protecting. Eleanor opened the file, her hands trembling slightly. Inside was a multi-page report, typed and signed by Dr. Silas Croft himself. The third major twist was delivered in the cold, clinical prose of the man who had orchestrated the entire tragedy. Croft's official report was a masterpiece of self-exonerating fiction. He claimed that the twins' unnatural sibling attachment was far more severe than initially diagnosed, describing it as a rare and violent form of shared psychosis. According to the report, the girl's condition had degenerated rapidly despite his best therapeutic efforts. He wrote that their shared identity began to fracture not into two healthy individuals, but into a paranoid, delusional state where each sister saw the other as a hostile imposter. The narrative he constructed was one of a tragic and unavoidable medical catastrophe. He claimed to have been working late one evening when he was alerted by a commotion in their wing. He arrived, he wrote, to a scene of unimaginable horror. One of the twins, he was conveniently unable to be certain which one in the chaos, had violently attacked her sister in a sudden psychotic break before taking her own life. It was, he concluded with feigned professional regret, a clear and tragic case of murder-suicide. The single scream the nurse had heard was explained away as the final, terrible moment of this psychotic explosion. The report was chilling in its plausibility, a perfect story to feed to a board of trustees and a public that held him in such high esteem. It transformed the perpetrator into the heroic first responder, the witness to a tragedy he had worked so hard to prevent. The final page of the report offered a solution to the potential scandal, to protect the good name of the asylum and to spare the girl's distant family from the shame of the horrific event. Dr. Croft had taken it upon himself to handle the matter with the utmost discretion. He stated that he had personally overseen their burial. The two sisters, he claimed, were laid to rest together in the asylum's unmarked potter's field, their graves deliberately left without names to ensure the tragic secret would be kept forever. The report was a lie, Eleanor knew, but it was a perfect one. It accounted for the disappearance, explained the lack of public records, and cemented Dr. Croft's reputation as a compassionate, if tragic, figure. It was not a medical conclusion. It was the story a murderer wrote to absolve himself, a fiction that had been protected as fact for nearly 100 years. The absence of a grave marker was not an oversight. It was a seal on a tomb of secrets. Eleanor stared at the official report, its words a vile perversion of the truth she was beginning to uncover. The murder-suicide narrative was a monstrous lie, a story crafted by a predator to paint himself as a savior. She instinctively rejected it, not just because it contradicted the nurse's journal and the doctor's own private ledger, but because it felt too clean, too self-serving. Alistair Finch, however, treated the document as gospel. "There you have it, Miss Vance," he said, his relief palpable. "A tragedy, to be sure, but a documented one." Dr. Croft acted to prevent a scandal that would have shattered public trust in this institution. He saw the report as the end of the inquiry, a final, authoritative word that rendered her other evidence circumstantial and speculative. For him, the case was closed. But for Eleanor, the report was not an answer. It was a symptom of a much deeper disease. The key to the crime was not in the fabricated events of that night, but in the environment that had allowed such a fabrication to stand unchallenged. How could a doctor, no matter how respected, unilaterally declare a murder-suicide, bury the bodies in secret, and face no questions, no inquiry, no oversight whatsoever? The report wasn't just a lie. It was a testament to the absolute unchecked power of the man who wrote it. Eleanor's focus shifted from the crime itself to the system that had enabled it. She needed to understand how Dr. Silas Croft had become a god within the walls of Blackwood Asylum, a man whose word was law and whose actions were beyond reproach. She returned to the county annex, her search now more targeted. She wasn't looking for patient files, she was hunting for the administrative DNA of the asylum. She began meticulously combing through the minutes of the hospital board of trustees meetings from the 19-teens and early 1920s. She read through endless discussions of budgets, building maintenance, and staffing. It was a tedious, soul-crushing process, but Eleanor was patient. She was looking for the subtle shifts in power, the moments where oversight was ceded and authority was consolidated. She was looking for the birth of a king. And slowly, page by page, she found it. Dr. Croft had arrived at Blackwood with a sterling reputation, and he had masterfully leveraged it. The evidence was not in a single dramatic document, but in a slow, creeping accumulation of influence. She found letters he had written to the board, elegantly arguing for the necessity of clinical autonomy. He wrote that the emerging science of the mind required a bold, unhindered approach free from the stifling bureaucracy of layman administrators. He painted a picture of himself as a lone visionary held back by outdated protocols. The board, composed of wealthy industrialists and socialites eager to be seen as patrons of modern science, was completely seduced. They saw his arrogance as brilliance, his ambition as progress. One by one, they voted to grant his requests. First, he was given complete control over patient intake and diagnosis in his experimental ward. Then, she found the most damning documents of all. In a series of letters from late 1920, just months before the Harper twins arrived, the hospital board officially granted Dr. Silas Croft unchecked power over his entire wing. He was given the sole authority to approve and oversee all experimental therapies with no requirement for external review. He was granted the power to restrict access to his wards, his patients, and their records, all under the justification of protecting the scientific integrity of his research. They had, in effect, given him his own private kingdom, a black box inside the asylum where he could operate with total impunity. The letters were a shocking abdication of responsibility, a complete surrender of oversight in the name of progress. Eleanor sat back, the pile of correspondence laid out before her. This was the true horror. The murder-suicide report was not a story that no one had bothered to question. It was a story that no one had the power to question. Croft had meticulously built a fortress of authority around himself, brick by brick, memo by memo. He had created a system where his word was the only evidence that mattered. The board of trustees, dazzled by his reputation and seduced by his promises of medical miracles, had handed him the keys to the kingdom and then politely looked away. He hadn't just covered up a crime, he had created a world where his actions could not be defined as criminal in the first place. The evil that had swallowed the Harper twins was not born in a moment of psychotic rage. It had been nurtured, funded, and formally approved by the very people entrusted to protect them. The letters from the hospital board confirmed Eleanor's darkest suspicions. Dr. Croft had been a law unto himself, but knowing he had the power to commit and conceal a crime was not the same as knowing what that crime truly was. The official report was a lie, and the doctor's ledger detailed a cruel experiment, but the final terrible moments of the Harper twins' lives remained shrouded in the institution's silence. The key, Eleanor felt, lay somewhere in Nurse Bennett's journal. She reread the terrified entries, searching for any detail she might have overlooked, any clue hidden within the nurse's frightened prose. Her eyes kept returning to a strange, almost poetic phrase in one of the final entries written after the twins had vanished completely. The nurse wrote of her fear of Dr. Croft, of seeing him walk the halls with his cold, righteous certainty, and of the terrible secrets he kept in the place where he kept his angels. The phrase felt significant, more than just a figure of speech, where he kept his angels. It sounded like a location. Tucked into the back pocket of the old diary was a loose, folded piece of paper Eleanor had initially dismissed as a stray note. She unfolded it now, her heart quickening. It was a small, hand-drawn map of a section of the asylum, sketched in the same hand as the journal. It showed the layout of the children's wing, but with one cryptic addition. An arrow pointed to a long, featureless wall in the old infirmary, a section of the building that had been used for storage for the last 50 years. Next to the arrow was a single, chilling annotation, the same phrase from the journal, where he kept his angels. It was not a metaphor. It was a destination. Eleanor knew she could not get official permission to start tearing down walls in a historic building based on a cryptic note in a nurse's diary. She also knew that Alistair Finch would obstruct any such request, burying it in paperwork until her grant money ran out. She had to go herself. One night, armed with a powerful flashlight, a crowbar, and a copy of the nurse's map, she let herself into the abandoned asylum. The silence of the place at night was a living thing, vast and watchful. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the window frames, sounded like a footstep, a whisper. The air was cold, and the darkness outside the beam of her flashlight seemed absolute. She followed the map through the decaying labyrinth of the main building until she reached the old infirmary. The wing was a wreck abandoned since the fire in 1933 and never fully repaired. Plaster hung from the ceiling in great sagging sheets, and the floor was a treacherous landscape of rubble and broken glass. She found the wall from the map, a long, uninterrupted stretch of brick and plaster exactly as depicted. It looked like any other wall in the decrepit building, but as she ran her hand along its surface, she felt a subtle difference in the texture of the plaster in one section. It was smoother, less decayed. Tapping it with the crowbar produced a hollow, resonant sound that was distinctly different from the solid thud of the surrounding wall. Someone had bricked this up. It was a seal. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, she wedged the crowbar into a crack and pulled. A chunk of plaster broke away, revealing newer, cleaner brickwork underneath. For over an hour, she worked in the suffocating darkness, prying bricks loose one by one until she had created an opening large enough to squeeze through. The air that flowed out of the opening was stale and cold, untouched for nearly a century. She shone her flashlight into the darkness beyond. It was not a storage closet. It was a room, a hidden chamber that did not appear on any of the asylum's official floor plans. She climbed through the opening, her light cutting through the absolute blackness. It was an observation room. On one side was a thick pane of glass, now dark and coated with grime, looking out into what must have been an adjacent patient room. The room itself was small and horrifyingly intimate. It contained two small iron-framed cots, placed side by side. On the floor next to each cot were leather restraints, sized for the wrists and ankles of a child. This was not a treatment room. It was a cage. This was the heart of Dr. Croft's laboratory. This was the place where he had conducted his monstrous experiment on identity, observing his subjects through the one-way glass like insects in a jar. A wave of nausea and grief washed over Eleanor as she imagined the terror of the two little girls, isolated and imprisoned in this secret space. Then her light fell upon the far wall. There, preserved in the dry, still air of the hidden room, was a child's drawing, sketched in charcoal directly onto the plaster. It depicted a tall, thin man in a long coat, his face a featureless blank. He stood between two identical girls with wild red hair. In his hand, he held a long, sharp needle, its point aimed directly at one of the girl's arms, while the other girl watched, her drawn mouth a perfect circle of silent horror. The drawing was a raw, unfiltered cry from the past, a final testament from a victim. It was the moment of the crime, captured by the hand of a child. The discovery of the hidden observation room and the child's haunting drawing shattered the last vestiges of Dr. Croft's official narrative. The murder-suicide was a lie. The fire was a convenient excuse. The truth was colder, more methodical, and infinitely more cruel. Eleanor documented everything, taking photographs of the room, the restraints, and the chilling drawing on the wall. She felt a grim sense of victory, but also a profound sorrow. She had found where the crime had taken place, but she still did not know precisely what that crime was. The drawing showed a needle, the ledger spoke of severing a bond, and the nurse had heard a single scream. These were pieces of the puzzle, but the final terrible image remained incomplete. Back in her small, cluttered apartment, surrounded by piles of research papers and photographs, Eleanor felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that she was still missing a crucial piece of the story. Her eyes fell upon the burlap doll which she now kept on her desk. It had been her first clue. the tangible link to the lost twins, and it had sat there like a silent sentinel throughout her investigation. She picked it up, the coarse fabric cool against her skin, the button eyes staring blankly. She thought about the care with which it had been made, a small comfort created in a place of profound cruelty. And then she remembered her initial observation, the detail that had been overshadowed by the subsequent, more dramatic discoveries, the small, carefully stitched tear in its seam. Alistair had dismissed it. She herself had almost forgotten it. But now, in the context of the hidden room and the absolute desperation the twins must have felt, the tiny, meticulous repair seemed like more than just a mended toy. It was too neat, too deliberate. The nurse's journal had described the girls' complete isolation from one another. But what if they had found a way? What if, in their shared loneliness, they had managed one final secret act of communication? Her mind raced, connecting the disparate threads of her investigation. The doll, with its lock of real hair, was a symbol of their shared identity. The hidden room was the place where that identity was systematically dismantled. The stitched seam, she suddenly realized, was not a repair. It was a hiding place. The fourth major twist arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet, deliberate pull of a thread. Her hands trembling with a mixture of hope and dread, Eleanor took a small pair of scissors and carefully snipped the tight, century-old stitches along the doll's side. The thread was strong, meant to hold. She worked slowly, painstakingly, unsealing the secret that had been protected for nearly 100 years. The seam opened, revealing a tiny, dark cavity within the doll's stuffing. Her breath caught in her throat. Something was inside. Using a pair of tweezers, she reached into the opening and pulled out a minuscule, tightly rolled scrap of paper no bigger than her fingertip. It was brittle and brown with age, and she was terrified it would crumble into dust. With the delicate precision of an archivist, she unrolled the tiny scroll under the bright light of her desk lamp. On the fragile surface, written in the faint, spidery script of a child trying to write as small as possible, were 3 short, terrible sentences. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible. They were a final, desperate message, a voice from beyond the grave, smuggled out of the darkness in the heart of a doll. The note read, "He took Rose, I'm next. Hide this." The words hit Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. The entire narrative, the entire mystery, snapped into its final, horrifying shape. It was not a murder-suicide. Dr. Croft's experiment had not ended in a simultaneous psychotic break. It had been a sequential execution. He had not tried to save them. He had eliminated them, one by one. The single scream the nurse had heard in the night, that was Rose. That was the moment Dr. Croft had concluded the first half of his monstrous experiment, and Iris, alone in her cell, knowing her sister was gone and that she was next, had performed one last act of defiance. She had scribbled this tiny, terrified message and hidden it inside the doll, her only companion, a silent witness imbued with her sister's hair. It was a message in a bottle, a final attempt to tell the world the truth. For a century, the doll had not just been a memento, it had been a vessel for the truth, a lie detector waiting for someone to finally open it and read the story hidden inside. The case was no longer about what had happened to the Harper twins. It was about what had been done to Rose and then to Iris. The lie was not in the asylum's records, but in the very fabric of the doll itself. The tiny, rolled-up note changed everything. It was the voice of Iris Harper herself, a direct accusation from the grave that incinerated every lie, every report, every carefully constructed deception. Eleanor now had the complete, unbroken chain of evidence. The doctor's chilling intent laid bare in his ledger, the nurse's terrified eyewitness account, the hidden torture chamber, the child's drawing of the crime, and now the victim's own final words. The story was no longer a historical inquiry into a cold case. It was an exhumation of a monstrous evil, and she was ready to present it to the world. She compiled her findings into a formal presentation, a meticulous, undeniable narrative of the crime and its century-long cover-up. She requested a special hearing before the County Historical Society, the very body that oversaw the asylum's archives, and she made sure that Mr. Alistair Finch was required to be in attendance. The hearing took place in the county's old courthouse, a grand, wood-paneled room that seemed to amplify the gravity of the occasion. The board members sat at a long, imposing table, their faces stern and impassive. Alistair Finch sat in the front row of the small audience, his posture rigid, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He looked smaller than he did in his archive, a relic removed from his natural habitat. Eleanor stood at the podium, and with a calm, analytical voice that belied the fury in her heart, she began to speak. She did not start with the twins. She started with the institution itself, with the celebrated Dr. Silas Croft and the absolute power the Board of Trustees had so carelessly granted him. She laid the foundation of the crime first, showing how the system itself had been complicit. One by one, she presented her evidence. She projected images of the doctor's ledger, his cold words filling the silent room. She read the harrowing entries from Nurse Bennett's journal. She showed them the photographs of the hidden room, the cots, the restraints, the child's drawing on the wall. A low murmur rippled through the room. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Alistair Finch remained perfectly still, his face a pale, emotionless mask. Finally, Eleanor came to the doll. She held it up for all to see. For a century, she said, her voice ringing with conviction, this doll was the only thing that remembered the truth. She described finding the hidden note, and then she projected a magnified image of it onto the screen behind her. He took Rose. I'm next. Hide this. The room fell into a stunned, absolute silence. The child's desperate scrawl was an irrefutable cry for justice. Eleanor had not just solved a mystery, she had given a voice back to the dead, and that voice was now accusing one of the most celebrated figures in the county's history of being a child murderer. She concluded her presentation, her work done. She had unearthed the evil, and now she was laying it at the feet of the institution that had helped to bury it. As the board members sat in shocked silence, unsure how to respond, a single figure rose from the audience. It was Alistair Finch. He did not look angry or defeated. In fact, his expression was one of strange, quiet contemplation. He walked slowly toward the podium where Eleanor stood, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. He did not challenge her evidence. He did not defend the asylum. Instead, he stopped before her and placed a small cardboard box of his own family records on the podium. The final twist was delivered not through a document or a revelation from the past, but through a calm, horrifying confession in the present. Alistair opened the box and produced a small, silver-framed photograph. It showed a stern, bearded man with cold, intelligent eyes. It was the man from the asylum's portraits, the man from the child's drawing. A fascinating theory, Miss Vance, Alistair Finch said, his voice barely a whisper, yet carrying across the silent room. A truly remarkable piece of historical detective work. He looked up from the photograph and met Eleanor's eyes, his own gaze holding a century of secrets. You should know, he said, his voice calm and steady, Dr. Silas Croft was my great-grandfather. The silence in the room was no longer one of shock, but of pure, unadulterated horror. The archivist was not a gatekeeper protecting a legacy. He was family, and this was the family business.